We are in the end of a 4-week series called Tragic Hero, looking at the life of a man named David, who in our Bible has been a shepherd, a giant slayer. He's been wanted by the king. He has been maybe not murderer, but he has assisted in murder. He has been wife stealer. He has been all the things. He is reality television in the books of our Bible. And he has had a lot of things said about him. In the midst of that, he's been called a man after God's own heart, even in the midst of everything. And the reason we call it Tragic Hero is because for much of David's life, he is a hero, but there are these moments where he doesn't just trip. I mean, he falls valiantly down a cliff in just the way that he makes mistakes. And so we're looking at his story and figuring out, man, what does the story of David have to teach us? And in week 1, we saw that David is faithful. Right, we looked at the story of David versus Goliath, probably the most famous story in the life of David, and we said, man, in these things, David is faithful. And then in week 2, we looked at David and Jonathan is a friend of his. They say actually that their souls were knit together, so they're not just friends, like they are besties. And we looked at that and saw what does it mean to have faithful friends. And then in week 2, we talked about faithful friends again, but not just someone who loves you and is for you, but there's someone who tells you hard truths, even when you don't want to hear it. And we looked at the story of David where he steals another man's wife and then sends that man off to war to die and thinks that he's getting away with it. And his friend Nathan steps in and calls him to the mat, calls him out on his sin. And in the midst of that, he tells him the consequences of his sin. And so this week, we're going to look at the consequences that David is dealing with. But I want to take you back to when I was a kid. And I was not a great kid. I wasn't like a bad kid. I wasn't like, selling drugs on the street corner at 5 or anything. But I wasn't a great kid, and we had discipline in my house as we should, so that way that me and my siblings didn't grow up and just be punks. And so in my house, the way that they disciplined when I was older was grounding, take your car keys, take your phone, that sort of, like, take all your fun. Just take my fun. That's what it was. But when I was little, it was spanking. Okay, and I don't know what you did in your house growing up, and I'm not here to talk about how discipline works or what's okay and what's not, but in my house, we spanked. And here's the deal. Thanks, man. Thanks. In my house, we would spank, and in the middle of that, there was all of these things that came with that. And so for me, I was deathly afraid of spanking. I really hated punishment in general. Like when I was 4 years old, my dad came home one day, and he walks into my room that me and my brother shared, and I'm just sitting on my bed, which that was like my earliest punishment, just get sent to your room. And that was before bedrooms were fun. Like in a lot of your bedrooms, you're like, that's where my video games are, like my laptop, like all my fun things. We didn't have any fun things. In my bedroom was a bed. And so you would get to the room, my dad comes home from work and sees me sitting there, and he goes, well, Lane, what are you doing? I'm in trouble. I did something bad. So he goes and walks to the kitchen, and he sees my mom, and he goes, well, what did Lane do? She goes, what are you talking about? He's sitting in his room because he's in trouble. He did something bad. And she goes, I didn't send him there. So my conscience was just so guilty from the beginning that I would just do bad things and go ahead and suffer the consequences. I would just avoid the mom and dad conversation very early. And so spankings, like I was terrified of them. I didn't like being in trouble, and it didn't keep me from doing bad things. It just made me be creative in getting away with them. And so in that, I hated them because here's the thing. Mom and dad, when dad spanked, like he's stronger than mom. Like my dad's not like a super athlete, but you're just stronger than my mom. And so there was the fear that came with that. But when mom spanked, it was the worst because mom was not an athlete, and so she missed a lot. Like it was like back, arms, sibling. Like I'm like, what are you doing? What is this? And so like the threat would be, you just wait till your dad gets home. I was like, yes, please. Like it's aggressive, but it's accurate, man. I'll take it. And so in the midst of that, when time for a spanking came, like I was tears. I was begging and pleading with God. Like I was like, no! Calling on angels to come and intercede for me. I was praying a hedge of protection around my backside, like anything that I could come up with. That's what spanking was like in my house. And that's a normal reaction. Like discipline is like that. No one should enjoy that process. No one should walk into that and be like, give me your best shot. Mostly because they'll hit harder and faster, right? And I got that. Like, I was like, if I beg and plead, my parents will all of a sudden become like Jesus, and they will start exhibiting this thing called grace and mercy. So I caught on to that at a very young age. I was like, if I look like I'm going to war, we're talking 1 to 2 swings, man. My little sister was not as wise. And so whenever it was time for my little sister to be in trouble, my mom would just be like, that's it, it's spanking time. She never got to wait till dad get home. Like, mom just took her chances. And so she'd be like, that's it, it's spanking time. And I would like buckle up. I was like, this is about to be a show, man, this is awesome. And so we would always go back to the bedroom. They never whip us in the living room. God can see what happens in the living room. It's a back room where he doesn't go. And so she would be, and my sister, like, when I was going, I would be like preparing myself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, like reciting scripture, like Satan get behind me. My sister was going and she was like, why don't you use something heavier? Like harder. She was like, is this gonna take a while? Like, what? Like, can we do it during a commercial? I'm sitting there like, you need to send her to an asylum. Like something, send her back. I want a new one. There's something crazy about her. She grows up to be a DC supervillain. I know the end of this story. And so I would look at that and I would just be amazed because I was like, that is not the response that you expect in the midst of punishment. And when you're a kid, man, punishment is like the worst thing you can go through. Like that's the deepest tragedy you know at a very young age. Like when you've done something wrong and you have to suffer the consequences, it's like the first time that you feel anxiety and you're like, it's coming. I'm a bad kid. I'm a terrible person. Jesus is never going to love me. Like that's the first time that you begin to feel those feelings. And so I would watch and I would just watch in amazement because I was like, man, that is not how you respond in this situation. And we've seen people in the midst of certain moments in high-pressure situations or in things that should cause great levels of anxiety or in the midst of great tragedy or large-scale punishment that just respond in a really weird way, and we're like, that is not how that is supposed to go. Like they should be losing it. We say that because as we walk into the story of David and we see the consequences of his sin, we expect David to be losing it, and for parts of it he is, but there's this moment where the people in his household are confused at his response to one of the most tragic moments in David's life. And as we walk into that, it becomes interesting that what we see in David's response, even though his is consequence to his own sin, we can learn a lot just in the midst of tragedy in general. And what I want us to see is this before we get going anywhere, because we're going to deal in some sticky situations. And if you have a question about the statement, you can ask your small group leader. But David is dealing in the consequences of his own sin. This is a direct consequence from God that he said, because of this, you will experience this. And what I want us to see is not every tragedy that we go through is a consequence of our sin, but every tragedy is a consequence of sin. And so this idea that sin exists in the world, the fall of man is real, and it affects not just in our actions as people, but in creation and in general. And so when we look at large-scale tragedy, when we look at the midst of things that we can't quite get, and we go, well, how could a good God this? The answer is that sin still exists in the world. It causes bad things to happen, and it creates tragedy amongst us. And so sometimes we bring our own tragedies on ourselves when we have to suffer the consequences of our own sin, because even the salvation of Jesus cannot always keep us from consequence. It just keeps us from condemnation. But in the midst of that, every tragedy is still a consequence of sin. And so I want us to see that because as we wrestle through the story of David, what I don't want us to see is, man, if I do X, then I get Y. And that's just not true because God disciplines in different ways. Man, there are consequences that work in different ways. We talked about last week that there is always consequence for sin, but we don't want to think that every tragedy is a consequence of our own sin, that we have brought something on ourselves. And so as we're thinking about that and we're going into places from tonight, man, we're just start with this, that people in the midst of tragedy should be losing it. Like that's just our natural inclination. That's my natural thought process of watching my little sister like, you shouldn't be worried about commercial breaks. You should be worried about survival because you're 4 feet tall and you can't survive a strong wind. You should be concerned. We know that as high school students who've experienced a little bit more life than some of our middle school counterparts, and we've gone through some things, man, we've seen some tragedy, we've seen some things, some of us have suffered the consequences of our own actions, and we know that when life gets hard, we tend to lose it. We tend to lose it, and primarily, what we'll see is that's also the common moment for us to begin to lose faith. That somewhere along the way, someone has told us that God only wants good and sweet and beautiful butterfly flower things for you. And so when everything isn't good and beautiful in springtime, that when it's winter and it's a blizzard outside, like, oh, well, then God just must not be real because I've been told this. And whoever told you that is a liar. Because what we see is God is present in all seasons. He is present in the midst of all storms. He's in the presence of all hard circumstances. As we navigate tragedy, it's often the hardest time to have faith. I want you to think about this. There are moments in our life that things are going really, really good. We're operating on all cylinders. We're winning a lot. We've got great grades. We've made the team. We've got all this stuff going on, right? And everything's going good. And a lot of times we're like, man, we need to learn to be thankful to God in that. But what I want you to think about is this, is oftentimes we're not very thankful. Like things are going good. We don't think about God. He's kind of in the back of our heads. Like when we watch on television, the first time that a television character usually talks to God is when someone's dying or sick and they're going to plead with them. And so we look at that and we go, when things are really good, we forget about God. The flip side, when things are really bad, when it's deep, deep, deep tragedy, we decide that we don't believe in God. That those are the moments that we go, man, God must not be real. God must not be doing a good thing in my life anymore. But most of us, we live somewhere in the middle where never is everything really, really good, but nothing is ever terrible. And so we're just tested enough, we're just pushed up against enough. In the midst of that, we're challenged a little bit, but we grow in our faith, and we're better to move on to the next one. That's how most of our lives are going at most times. But what I want you to think about is this. We're not going to talk as much about the highs tonight because we're going deep, deep, deep. But we're talking about this, that it's those moments in the deep, dark pits where everything is dark and we're prone to lose faith that we need the most faith. And so how do we get there? Because we've seen those people who have endured tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and we're like, how could you still believe in God? And we have to figure out, man, how do we get to that place? Because it's in the midst of that tragedy where we're going to need more faith than we've ever had before. We're going to need God to show up. We're going to need more trust in him than we've ever needed before. And we walk into that moment in David's life, whereas last week we see David's biggest mess up, a couple of his biggest mess ups. He really strings them together. It's polite of him to just squeeze it all into one chapter. Thank you, David. But today we just see just this deep darkness of what it means for him to go through something that is incredibly hard. Because the consequence of David's sin, of stealing another man's wife, of sending that man off to war to die, and of trying to cover it up, God speaks to David and says, hey, you're going to have a baby with Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, and you need to know that baby's not going to live. And we look at that, and I want to be very real with you. Like, we read that, and we go, man, why would God do that? And he doesn't give us a lot of answers why. And I don't have a lot of answers for you. And to lie to you and to go, man, God's doing a good thing. He's got a better plan. He is, and we see that, but I don't know why that's David's consequence. And part of faith and part of walking with God is that sometimes we read scripture and we're like, what the heck is that? That you and I, we don't get to be God, we don't get to play God, and so we just look at these moments for God and we go, he's God and I'm not. And I don't know why he does it, but he does, and we learn something from it in the life of David, and we see that this is what happens as he's suffering this consequence in chapter 12. It says, the Lord struck the baby that Uriah's wife, that's Bathsheba, had born to David. And he became deathly ill. And David pleaded with God for the boy. And he fasted, and he went home, and he spent the night lying on the ground. And the elders of his house stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat anything with them. This is the moment that David's doing something that feels very normal. David is about to lose his kid, no matter how that came about. Man, David's about to lose his son. And he's in distress, and he's fasting, and he's pleading to God. And his friends are coming alongside him, hey, get up, it's going to be better. And David's like, no, I'm here, man. Like, I live on this floor now. On the seventh day, the baby died, but David's servants were afraid to tell him that the baby was dead. And they said, look, while the baby was alive, we spoke to him. And he wouldn't listen to us. So how can we tell him now that the baby is dead? He may do something desperate. And when David saw that his servants were whispering to each other, he guessed that the baby was dead. So he asked his servants, is the baby dead? He is dead, they replied. I don't think we have to question how dark this passage is and the depths with which it takes us, because I've had to say the words, the baby is dead, more times than I ever want to say from this stage in my whole life. And David's wrestling in this moment, and he's pleading with God that he knows he sinned. Right before this, he goes, God, I've sinned against you. He knows his consequence. God has told him his consequence, and David still pleads with God and says, man, save me from this consequence. And I want to say something very quickly. I don't know if this happens often, but I think we can look at this and go, well, how dare David plead with God? God's already told him. He knows he's to suffer a consequence. I don't think that David's doing anything wrong here. I think that David's doing everything right. I think that he's doing everything normal. Listen, when Emery gets sick, and she had a lot of ear infections when she was younger, and she would stay up all night, and an ear infection is not something that causes death, but I would just sit in my bed and just pray. Because when it's your kid, it's everything. I mean, everything feels like the end. And so when you're actually faced with the end, I mean, David is doing something very normal here, and he's pleading with God, and he's fasting, and he's going to God. And actually, it would almost make more sense for David to be mad at God, to say, hey, I know I did this wrong thing, but I've done so many great things. How could you take my son? And say, God, if I'm keeping score, my score for you is high. My score against you is very low. And yet you come in with this. And his servants get nervous because they go, man, he's been so depressed. What's he going to do? What's the end of this story for David? And rightfully so. I don't know if you've ever had to communicate to someone else that someone has died before, but it's not fun. And they're trying to figure out how to tell a dad that their kid is gone. This is tragedy. This is dark. And David, up to this point, is responding the way that a lot of us would. Man, we'd either abandon God or we would cry out to him, even if we didn't believe in him. This is what happens when they tell him, right? They say, well, what'll he do when he finds out? Well, this is what he does. And David got up from the ground. He washed, anointed himself, changed his clothes, and he went to the Lord's house and he worshiped. And then he went home and he requested something to eat, and so they served him food and he ate. And his servants asked him, why have you done this? While the baby was alive, you fasted and wept. But when he died, you got up and ate food? He answered, while the baby was alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let him live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I'll go to him, but he will never return to me. This isn't a commentary on how we shouldn't mourn in the midst of loss, how we shouldn't be upset in tragedy, because we should. I think the moment that Jesus weeps when his friend is dead in the New Testament shows us that it's okay to mourn and things like that. But I do think it's a commentary on this. When the world thinks that David shouldn't be faithful, when it doesn't make sense for him to get up and worship, he's faithful. Even when he shouldn't be. And not in the way that that we say, go, well, yeah, you should be. You should always be faithful to God. Not in the Sunday school answer, but in the way that it makes sense for him to retreat. I'll never forget being in high school and sitting across from my older brother who had been a pillar of the faith my whole life. We're sitting in a barbecue place in Georgetown. I'll never forget it. We're in a booth up against the window, and my brother begins to explain to me how he's decided that he doesn't believe in God anymore because of the stuff that we had gone through as kids, because of losing our mom. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, I'm 18, you're 24. Like, you know more Bible than I do. Tragedy shook him and broke him, and he abandons the faith. And it's not unnormal. Like, it's a very normal progression for him. But David, he's faithful. Yeah, it's a consequence of his own sin, but he's still faithful. And I think primarily because we sing this song, and I love Waymaker. It's a jam. In the midst of that song, we say, Waymaker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. Yeah, but do you know how dark it can get? Because that's darkness that I don't know. And David's clinging to this idea, check this out, that God is a promise keeper. And it doesn't look like he's a promise keeper right now because God has promised a lot of things to David about his lineage and what's going to come of his son, and now his son is dead. And so either God is a promise keeper or he's a liar. I mean, this is tough stuff, but man, when we sing about this God, we got to know that It's going to require us to be faithful even when it doesn't make sense to sometimes. It's going to require hard moments of the faith and walking through that and figuring out what that looks like. And so as we look at the story of David, when we dive in, what I want us to see is that at the end of this, what we should always be working towards, what we should always be moving towards, is building a faith that's confident in the storm, because sometimes it never stops raining. Sometimes our parents are getting divorced. Sometimes they're splitting up. Sometimes there's chaos in our home. Sometimes we're getting dumped from a relationship that we've been in for a really long time, and it's super messy. Sometimes we have really deep addiction. Sometimes our parents have really deep addiction. Sometimes our friends are abandoning us and they're exiling us, and we're on the outside looking in. Sometimes the world is falling apart at the seams, and sometimes we've brought it upon ourselves. Hear that. Sometimes we haven't. What will be the story that God is writing in us in those moments? What will be the promise that we cling to? Will we stay on the floor, or will we get up and worship? Man, we can beg and plead with God for him to change some things, but when the answer that we expect doesn't come, do we move forward, or do we abandon him? And here's why we can move forward. And here's why I think it's okay for David to plead with God. There's this moment where Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross, but he takes a moment and he's alone in the garden. Brings some of his disciples to pray with him, and they fall asleep on him. Great, you picked an awesome 12 dudes, man. And he goes into the garden and he goes, and this is Jesus. He's the Son of God without sin. And so in this moment, we see humanity, but we don't see sin. And this is what helps me make this decision about this. Jesus pleads with God to not have to go to the cross. Begs and pleads with him, says, if this can be removed from me, if there's another way for the salvation of humanity, do that, because I don't want to do this. And when there isn't, though, Jesus goes. Like if we got to be honest, we can't blame Jesus if he gets up out of the garden and goes, I'm good. Like sinful people, not worth my death. Scripture says that a good man maybe will die for a righteous person. And Christ dies for the sin of all humanity. In this moment, it makes sense for Jesus to abandon. Here's why we can move forward. When Jesus should have abandoned us in the garden, when he should have never gone to the cross, when he should have never left heaven, but because he did, we can move forward. Because Jesus did those things, we can have a confident faith in God and what he's doing, even when the darkness is very dark. Even when the tragedy is really deep, even when we've brought it upon ourselves and we're in the middle of our own consequences, knowing that God is still a promise fulfiller. Because what he does is David, after this, goes to comfort his wife. They have another kid together. That kid goes on to be the king, and the lineage is established from there and brings about Jesus. And God keeps his promises. And God does something great in that. And it doesn't take away from the tragedy that David endures. Like, I don't think there's a point in his life that was like, man, it's okay that I lost my son because God did a good thing. I've talked to a lot of parents who lose kids. It's never okay. But will we have faith even when it feels like we shouldn't? Are we building a confident faith in the storm? If you've been up here a lot, you've heard my testimony. And when I was a senior in high school, my mom was diagnosed with brain cancer, and it was just a fury of things. It happened super fast. It moved very fast. And there was this moment, I was growing up in youth ministry, and we're hanging out. The guy who was like our George, his name was Brian Ward. Him and his wife served in youth ministry, and they had this small house in the middle of Georgetown. A lot of times on weekends, we would just go hang out at their house every night. Like they had an open door policy, so all we had to do was call them ahead of time and say, hey, we're bringing like 17 teenagers to come hang out in your house. Is that cool with you? Awesome. And just hang up before they could say no. That was kind of the secret. And in the midst of that, we're all showing up there one night. We're hanging out in their living room. We're sitting on the couch, on the floor. We're scattered everywhere, and I'm with my friends, and life is crazy. Things are not going well. My mom is sick. We all know that she's moving towards going to be with Jesus. Like she is dying. There's no way around it. And we're sitting there and we're joking around, but occasionally we'd get to have this serious conversation. And she leans over to me, the mom does. Her name's Chastity, and she looks over and she goes, like, what is going on? I was like, what are you? I'm sitting on your couch in your living room. Like, that's what's going on. That's what we're doing. It seems pretty clear to me. And she was like, no, like, here's what I don't get. Like, you should be falling apart all the time. But I'm with you a lot. Like, you're at my house all the time. You're at church. Like, you're with all these people. And nothing about you seems to have changed. And I was sitting there thinking, and the truth is there were definitely moments that I was falling apart. Like, to say otherwise is a lie. I just was polite enough to not fall apart in public because that's awkward and people don't want to deal with that. But I'm sitting there and she goes, and I don't get it. And then there was this pause and she looks at me and she goes, like, I know that we've all been praying for you. And then she pauses again and she goes, so I guess maybe that's it? So here's this woman who's like pinnacle of the faith in my life, man. She's just a pillar of the faith. And she's like, so maybe prayer really does work? And like maybe Christians really can come out on the other side of tragedy. And I'm just sitting there at 18 and I'm like, sure? That sounds right. Because I don't know. Like, I don't know, but here's what I do know. I got to talk to the church school here today, and I do know this, that the scripture talks about a peace that passes all understanding, and what that means, just let me translate, that there's a peace that we don't understand. And it doesn't come in the great moments of happiness. That's a peace that we understand. Like, that's a peace that we get. But what we don't get is David who gets up off the floor after his kid dies and worships. That's what we don't get. We don't get our friend who we know their home is falling apart. Their parents are splitting up. Their mom and their dad's on their third, fourth marriage, and everything is crazy. Their dating relationship is broken. They feel like they don't have any friends, and then they just show up and they're good. They should be losing it. But here's what we know. We can have a faith that's confident in the storm. Because David does. Because Jesus says we can. It doesn't just come naturally, man, but to build a faith. Here's how I think David does it. He's faithful when he's young and early on, and he builds up a lifetime of things that God has done in his life. He's killed lions and bears and giants. He went from a shepherd to a king. He remembers the moment that he was anointed to be king. He remembers Jonathan, his friend who dies in the last chapter of 1 Samuel. But he remembers his friend who was good and who was faithful to him. He remembers God showing up in all these moments. He was faithful. He had faithful friends. He had faithful friends who told him hard truths. And I think that that's how David has a faith that's confident in the storm, because he can look back and go, I've lost a lot, but it's not my score that's been winning with God. It's God's score that's been winning with me. And so I can be faithful, even when I shouldn't be. I'm going to pray for us, and we'll go to small groups. I mean, if you're in here tonight, and you've sat with us for 4 weeks, and you've heard about David, and you've heard about his faith, and you've heard about his friends, and at the end of the day, you just go, I can't have a faith that's confident in the storm, because I don't have a faith in Jesus at all. I mean, if that's you, please don't go to your small group and just answer questions like you know God when you don't. Pull your leader aside and say, hey, tell me about a Jesus that gives me peace in the middle of my parents' divorce. That gives me peace when we're broke, feels like we're losing our home. That gives me peace when I'm losing people to death. That gives me peace when my friends have abandoned me. That gives me peace when my season is over. That gives me peace when I've been broken up with, when I've been dumped and I feel like I'm alone. I want to know that Jesus that doesn't make it all easier, but that gives me faith in the storm. If that's you, man, just talk to your small group leader tonight and ask them about that. We don't assume that everybody in here knows Jesus, but we do believe that everyone in here needs to know Jesus.